So before we formally start, I wanted to say, like, for each one of you, as we go into this, I want you to think about your families, right? And the stories that people tell in your families, and how important those stories are to the people that tell their stories, and how sometimes those stories maybe don't match the material facts at hand. Okay, to start, I want each of you guys to first tell us when your movie's playing next, so the people in the audience can go see it. And then talk to me about the difference as a filmmaker, and then we're going to go into specifically about our subjects, right? The difference between factual truth and emotional truth. Who wants to start? Who knows when their movie's playing next?
I'm just looking it up.
Okay, great. Do you know?
Sunday at something. I don't know. We just had our second screening just a minute ago. Actually,
So you have one more screening left?
Yeah, one more screening Sunday.
Okay.
Do you want me to talk about the difference between emotional truth and factual truth?
Go for it, Robert.
All right. Well, that's something.
For you, as a filmmaker.
No, it's an important thing. I mean, the thing is that you know, our film, it's about an actor in a documentary. So one of the things that's happening is that you're watching, you know, a like cinema verite, or sometimes or direct cinema, whatever you want to say, watching observational footage of an actor who's in her real life. So you're seeing her be theatrical. You're seeing her sort of, you know, pick certain words to tell stories, or, you know, behaving in certain ways that an actor would behave and a, you know, civilian would not behave. But to me, that was very interesting. But one of the most interesting things about it is just what that brings up about documentary filmmaking in general. Because to me, everyone's performing. I'm performing now. We're all performing how we're doing our things. The social performance, it's a kind of old idea about, you know, how to, you know, establish character and who you are as a person, is these social performances that we all play, gender performances, race performances, you know, all kinds of things. And so that brings up a lot. What we wanted to do, part of the formal ideas in the movie, a lot more happens in the movie that's beyond the formal stuff. But part of the formal ideas are that you see these performances, and then they start layering, and you start thinking about construction of storytelling. And to me, that, you know, the idea that you can capture an objective truth with documentary should absolutely be, you know, dead. It's impossible. It's dead. And so, well, what are we left with when we say that that's impossible? Or what does it mean when you say you can't be objective? Does it mean that there's no such thing as truth? I think that's worse. That's way worse if there's no truth in the world. So maybe truth is sort of when you see the layers, you know, and that's you know, factual truth is this happens, this happens, this happens. That's the goal of, like, you know, journalism. Basically speaking, that's a little bit simplistic, but you know what I mean. And an emotional truth is we have to edit, we have to construct, we have to use these layered performances to find something else, and that something else is sort of what an art experience should be, which is that you're moved to think about things differently, or you're moved to be questioned, and sometimes they're insolvable things. Sometimes, you know, you're watching and you're like, I don't really know how I feel now. And a lot of times documentaries are sort of judged like, if I don't know how I feel, it must not be telling me the truth, which is complete bullshit, obviously. Like, if you don't know how you're feeling, and you think about it 5 minutes, and you think about it differently in an hour, that's a good art experience from my end. So,
Jesse?
My film is showing at tonight at 7 or 7:30. I think. I'm not sure.
If you go at 7, you can make it for both.
Pick 7. So emotional truth is something I've been thinking a lot about. My film is not about an actor, but someone who actually does perform professionally as a pastor. It's a kind of performance to an audience. And it's something we thought a lot about. Because the way in which, you know, I would come back to the edit room and look at what I was filming with my subject, who's in that short scene, and there were some times when I believed his performance emotionally, and sometimes when I didn't. And it was a process of recognizing those performances and the quality of those performances. Maybe it sounds crude in the documentary world to talk about performance, but I think it's actually really useful. And we had to recognize, or I had to recognize, like you would with an actor's performance, is it good? Do I feel it? Is it real? And there are times when I had to make very judicious decisions about finding the performance that was emotionally true, maybe sometimes not even necessarily factually true, but emotionally true, and also times when the performance perhaps didn't ring emotionally true, but was still useful for other reasons. And this was I don't remember kind of having to search through my story with a character in the same way on another film. So and maybe it's partly my own evolution as a filmmaker and my understanding of my relationship to my subjects and the ways in which they perform for me, but also this search for truth in character.
I think that motion pictures in general, from the very beginning, have always had a very difficult relationship to the concept of factual truth. And in a way, I think that the difficulty of that relationship has been the catalyst and the engine that has driven, just in general, the development of nonfiction film. And what I mean by that is, if you generally, factual truth is considered something that exists in the province of essentially linguistic propositions. And what happens is, for a long time, you had images and motion pictures used purely as illustration. Let's talking like turn of a century stuff. And if you think about what happens when you look at a sentence that says something, and then it's coupled with an image, or let's say a shot. But the longer you look at that shot, the truth of what's being said in that sentence, in that proposition, is going to slowly dissipate and disintegrate in a way that you're going to start to see different things. Other things are going to come in and undermine it and make you think that it's not necessarily so. And I think that emotional truth is something that a lot of times is probably a stand-in for something more general, which is the truth of lived experience. What is it like to be in a place, to occupy that place for a certain time? And I think that actually what makes documentaries so interesting, and I think it's true in every film that essentially you make, is this constant push and pull between these two, between the desire to kind of at least create the illusion of factual truth, and then the realization that the medium itself is making you constantly fail at that task. So,
what do you mean? Talk to me about that failure.
Well, the failure is exactly that, is that what you see is what you want to convey, let's say, a simple factual idea. But the more you're sitting there and observing that idea rendered visually, the more it's going to become more complex, the more it's going to be, there's almost like a actually, in the movie, Armsdealer says something that he said every system is headed towards self-destruction. And there's something that happens with factual truth in documentary, and that's what makes it so interesting, and that's how I think you can get to that layering that Robert was just speaking of.
So Jesse, on that note, so like if you have the meta, right, of like where truth lies, and then you have an individual, right? And so the individual is telling you their truth, and then as an observer, they're sometimes being honest with you, but they're sometimes being dishonest with themselves. Right? And as a filmmaker, especially in your case, you have a pastor, a public person who's wavering on those lines. What do you do?
It was interesting in our relationship to recognize that there were the truths that we acknowledged with each other, and then there were things that should be not discussed or kept hidden. And that kind of tacit acknowledgement that there were things that we shouldn't actually talk about. I mean, that relationship was really never made explicit, but I found that to be a really a constant question for me was whether the film would I guess. To back up, one of the most interesting things my subject said to me when we were getting to know each other was that he had secrets, but not to tell me what they were, but that I should know that he had them, and that was enough for me, for a long time. And so that was sort of the half in, half out position that he took about himself and the truth that he was offering me. But that was enough, and it's such a delicate dance, that relationship, that I felt like I needed to respect his position for a while, a long time, actually.
So Robert, you have an actress, and she's asserting that she's one thing, but if she deviates from that, do you want to crack that? Like, where do you stand?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to just say I can't wait to see Maxim's film, but just hearing Jesse talk about the Overnighters, if you've seen the Overnighters, and we're trying not to spoil what happens too in the movie, because it's a very tricky line. So if I think if Jesse's being a little bit obtuse, maybe like have to like dance around it, it's just because you really don't want to know what he's like, what those lies are, because it's amazing. So I just want to say that because I'm a big fan of that movie. Well, I mean, what Brandy is going through in our film is she basically, you know, one of the ways that the film is kind of universal, I think, or speaks to people, is that like the sort of concept of marriage and parenting is a little bit of an untruth, you know. So you're buying into this thing. You're buying into this like thing that's sort of been set up, you know. Like, okay, well, we're supposed to do this, and there's evolutionary reasons we want to get married. There's like, you know, emotional reasons. There's all these reasons, but the biggest one probably is social and, you know, political even. Like you can, you know, health insurance and stuff like that. But like so that is sort of this construct of sort of untruthiness already, and what she's really doing is just breaking through that. And so in her performative way, she's sort of just like bouncing up against these things that have, you know, she made a decision to leave acting because she was having children, which is the decision that many women have to make. Some men too, but many women, and that put her in a little box. You know, and she liked being in a little box a little bit because she has this real sort of push and pull relationship with being a celebrity or being an actor. And that box became like this thing of which eventually became a big lie, you know, in some ways. She wasn't being herself. And so what you see in the movie is you see someone breaking through that, and you see someone who's like trying to be more deeply truthful about what she really thinks and feels, and finding, you know, now she's on the other side, and it's great. But while she's breaking through this, there's all these other performances she's doing. Sometimes she's being completely vulnerable and not an ounce of performance on her face, and sometimes she's being almost grandiose and theatrical and like, this is how it is and this is why it is, and choosing the most theatrical words she could choose. So you're seeing a person try to find truth through performance, you know? And that was just, to me, like, you know, I really don't know what I'm going to do next, like, for movies. Like, it's just like, that was, I mean, I got to think of some other ideas, because that was, like, the most amazing, you know, combination thing for me to observe.
So is it the range? Is that what you're seeking from her, is to see both so that you can see where it...
Well, it's just the layering. I mean, it's just the layering aspect of it, which is, like, because, yeah, the longer you watch something, I mean, I think when you watch Brandy in this movie, I think you think, like, oh, well, she's just playing to the camera now. And then she says this, and it's like, well, she can't be playing to the camera saying that. Like, that's impossible. And it's like, which is the same thing in The Overnighters, I think. It's like, he's saying this, he's manipulating the camera in this way, but then absolutely, why would he ever manipulate it in this way? Like, so it just, it's a back and forth, and if you don't hide that back and forth. You revel in it, and you sort of let it sit there, and you don't solve it for the viewer. Viewers are like really good at coming up with like these things because we've had a century of training, you know, and like especially, you know, smart viewers, you know. So it's like, yeah, that's part of it.
But like, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that one thing that I struggled with was, Robert, I don't know if this came up in with Brandy, but when my subject would acknowledge me and the camera's presence, and I would think, well, I remember one particularly emotionally overwrought moment where he said, "Am I doing this for the camera?" And I thought, you know, that's interesting, and I don't mind that I'm not trying to hide my presence particularly, but, and I think his relationship, his awareness of his relationship with the camera, not just me, but the camera and his representation on screen is interesting, but do I want to make that explicit in the film? And if I do, is that disrupting a kind of emotional engagement with the audience? You know, is it serving the narrative? You know, so that was a very kind of hard calibration for me. I
don't think we have to do that anymore. Like, I really
think...
But
wait, hold on. So Max, I have a question for Max. Which is, he's like, no. But no. So okay. So right, you're saying there's construction, and you have to locate. The audience has to be able to locate themselves in your story, right? And so the presumption, you guys both have films that are culturally legible to the United States, right? So construction becomes not necessarily. You don't have to construct proximity or like he's a likable person or whatever. But Max, you've got somebody who's ideologically possibly at odds with the United States. So you not only does he have to find the truth in that, but you also have to break through. Can you talk about that?
No, I think that that's really interesting when you're approaching a subject who, at the outset, has a credibility of less than 0, and then you're trying to figure out what do you do with that stance that you have yourself, and it's a very tricky thing because one example that I think I mentioned to you earlier is I'm sure a lot of you have seen The Act of Killing, and if you think about the two main characters in The Act of Killing, one of them is much more ideologically driven and kind of thinks in a much more ideological way about what happens. And for him, that serves as an actual defense mechanism. He can live a more normal life. Whereas the main character, Anwar, who you sort of see retching at the very end of a film, he's not ideological, he's a playboy completely. And for him, it's just a source of trauma. And I think that kind of how you deal with the way that the person sees the world, whether it's a defense mechanism or whether it's actually what they've come to believe about the world. And how you navigate that is very interesting. I did a film about Pussy Riot, and there was an interview that I didn't use in the film, but it was with the guy who basically, I'm sure a lot of people know, so they went into a church and did all these things, who initially pressed the charges against them, wrote up all the things, and he was kind of one of the big catalysts for why they were put on trial and all these things. And by the time he was being interviewed, he had regretted doing it. He didn't really care, but he had to play the role of the offended believer. That he had to play that he believed blasphemy to be this huge thing that should be punished. And he very openly said that you're assigned a role and you kind of have to play it for a certain time. And what you do with that is really tricky as a documentary, because on the one hand, you do want to understand where this person is coming from, how they see the world, that they do have these values, and then at the same time, you feel like, okay, but it's kind of bullshit. And and you want to challenge that. You want to see tension. You want to see the person respond to it. You want to see the person really deal with the consequences of their action and have that. Essentially, I think the most interesting thing, especially in interviews on camera, is when a person really struggles with that, when their ideological foundations are slightly shaken. And with the arms dealer, it was really interesting because you learn so much about, for me, all these concepts that I had about what the arms trade is, what the arms industry, even what weapons are, they kind of just fall apart. And you realize that for people that are on the inside, there aren't these lines. It's just cargo, or it's just they work in this military sphere, which we've privatized, and it exists like this, and it has a degree of normality. And even war has a degree of normality. And what you do with that worldview is really interesting, especially if you're trying to push a person to have some sort of, to reflect on their actions, to have some sort of moral accountability. And in this film, it was particularly interesting because the film is kind of a prison memoir written by the subject, but then it's also primarily made up over 20 some odd years of his home movies, so films that he was making of his own life. And so it was kind of trying to create this dialectic and to bring things out that's in the footage, but he may almost not be aware of. And so I think that's sort of a solution in this film, but I think it's different in every film, and that tension between wanting to push a person and to unmask those defense mechanisms that we build up when we are defensive about something, and finding a line between that and then just being deaf to what this person actually is and how they see the world.
Mm-hmm. Accountability. How do you feel about accountability as a word, Jesse?
Elaborate on that.
Several syllables.
No, but I mean, the idea, so you're talking about getting the person, Max, you can interrupt if I'm paraphrasing wrong, but the idea that somebody has a construct that may morally be indefensible, and there's an impulse to bring an accountability to that indefensible nature. Is that something you struggle with, or do you see that as your role?
I do struggle with, with regard to my film, I did struggle with that.
And you can use any of your films as because you've made more than one.
Yeah.
Because there are filmmakers who would say that I don't actually feel like it's my job to make someone accountable. It's my job to explore the complexity, right? But maybe not. So.
Yeah, I think it's. I'm thinking about what I chose to include and what I chose to withhold in my film, and how it was important for me to. To protect, I guess, less protect my subject than the core idea of the film that I felt would be obscured if I was less withholding, I guess, if that makes sense.
So in that sense, do you feel like there's there's a tension then between the trust that you have with your subject and the trust that you have with your audience?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, that comes down to sort of the space between, and I've talked about this before, but the legal rights you have and the moral rights you have. And I think you could say that. I don't know that. Let's throw it to Robert.
Yeah, let's throw it to Robert. Robert, jump in. Legal rights, moral rights.
Oh well, I mean, I don't think there's any reason for accountability, but it's a different set of scenarios. I mean, I think you said it best when it's like every film is different. I mean, and I think exploring is the best I can do. So, but at the same time. The star of my movie is going to be judged for the things that she says and does on camera, and so I have to, that's my fault. No one would have known these things if it weren't for me. I would have known them. I would have judged her maybe, but she doesn't care about that too much. I know Brandy's here, so she can tell me if she cares about me judging her. She judges me more. But she's judging me right now. Yeah. This performance is a lie. No. So I think that there's an accountability to the person, but the way you approach that is, to me, is not to say, okay, well we left a lot of things out, of course, because but that's sort of a given. You leave things out of a movie, like you're telling the movie you want to tell. It's not the idea that you're gonna let reality overwhelm the experience of a movie would be stupid. It's just like we edit for a reason,
So Robert, you mentioned though that you shared the movie with your subjects, and then you didn't they didn't release themselves until they'd seen the film, and that's a big leap of faith, because it's obviously really important for you with that relationship to be able to stand up together.
Yeah. So I'm going to roll back. So when you make a movie, generally when you start in a documentary and you have a subject, you ask them to sign a release before you interview them, so that basically anything they say you have the right to put in your film. Sometimes as a strategy, both for the subject to protect themselves, but also to have some kind of agreement, right? But sometimes as a trust-building exercise, or sometimes because you don't have the access that you want and the person wants to withhold that right, that person will not sign a release, or you agree to not sign that release. And so therefore, whatever you shoot, you don't actually yet have the right to bring into the public sphere, right? Until you have that release, you can't actually broadcast it or show it publicly, or you could be sued. And so in this case, Robert made the decision to make this. For how long did you work without a release? Till like last week?
18 months, 2 years. Yeah, I mean, like a long time, yeah.
Right? So he was agreeing to basically give the ability to show the movie to his subject.
Yeah, and there was a specific reason for that. It wasn't because, I mean, we're doing all these things. There's these layering things are happening. She's saying these things. These are actual experiences, and she knows what's going to be in there. We talked the whole time. And it's not like she would have necessarily said, you know what, I'm out. But that she knew that she could was the significant thing, because we treaded on like really, really thin ice sometimes. Not between each other, because we had a great relationship. We're very close. But on what was happening, like literally what was happening was troublesome, and was, you know, her life was collapsing, like as simple as that. And so it was the only way to do it was these tentative steps towards the thing that it became, and that's the exploring aspect of filmmaking that is exciting to me. You go in with an idea, you explore, you get somewhere else, and you know, to me, especially in this case, it would make no sense to make a film where it's like, okay, you've signed, so now I'm going to have this, and like you can't do that. So I think that didn't cut down. I mean, she never asked me. You know, she actually did give notes on the movie, which were all like smart things. Like, this is kind of boring, cut that. But nothing. But she was always really respectful of like, this is your film, and that was an armoring thing for Brandy too, to say, this is your version of the truth. You know, that was very important for her to think like, this is the truth, but it's your version. So that helped that dynamic.
Max, do you have releases?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, yeah.
You forgot to get releases, didn't you?
Right, yeah. I guess you can remember.
No, we had one guy who just like crossed out one word. Like, okay, what do you make with it? No, I guess for me, and this is sort of both the way that going back to what Jesse said a minute ago about omitting versus including certain things and what you do. What's so interesting, I think that for my own process is when you come across certain moments that really unsettle you and you don't know what the hell to make of them. And a lot of times you can't really put them in the movie because they're so big and they, in a way, they perform such a Copernican revolution in what you're doing that it's just outside of a movie. And I think, a lot of times I even watch movies like this and even maybe fault movies based on this. So for example, if a movie like Searching for Sugar Man, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen, in a way, the story, the sort of his Cinderella story of him coming to South Africa and doing all these things, if you look at it and you look at him, you can kind of tell that he was probably a pretty severe drug addict for a long time, that he has this tortured relationship with his family. But in a way, going into that would in a way undermine the story, and it's probably would take it in, and so you have to, for some reason, omit it. But then the more interesting cases of this is, I know I mentioned this earlier to you, what I struggled with is, for example, is talking with Victor, who's the arms dealer in jail, about atrocities in Africa. And he said that, and he says this thing, he goes, well, you know, a lot of times, the most horrendous things that you hear about, so like people having their limbs chopped off and like their lips cut off and all these things, like these really, really horrific punitive things, they're actually done by advancing armies during wartime as a way to prevent killing and prevent wars. And essentially what they do is that they will put a person, an army will be going through a village, they'll take a person and do this horrible thing to them, and that will serve as a deterrent for the local army to not fight. So they'll know that they're outnumbered, and they'll know, and they'll just sort of stop. And when I hear something like that, I am immediately confronted with the fact that I really don't understand, with my own ignorance, about what this world is like. And then, at the same time, it's almost what I was mentioning earlier about kind of how the categories start to crumble. Then I realized that, okay, so the way that we see war atrocity is really also skewed, because in a way, okay, normal murder in war is considered kind of not okay, but normal. And then this is something that we select and we punish as something that should never be done. And in a way, that is a surface level thing, but something like that is so hard to get in, even into a movie, because it is such a fundamental shift. Yeah, it's too big.
It's like a thing that just plows through your thing, and you're like, but a lot of times you try to get those things in there, and the best movies are the ones that get those big ideas in there, but somehow they interact with other major elements or something.
And I think that even if you can't get a big idea like that, I think that it's incredibly just helpful for us as filmmakers, because it forces us to, by shattering our misconceptions, it forces us to reach for sort of a greater complexity, even through the material, through the lived experience, through moving away from factual truth and realizing that, okay, that maybe if you place a person in this landscape, they'll, at least through osmosis, feel that nothing is as what they assumed it to be. And in a way, I think that it's almost like this battle between the factual constructs that we bring to a reality that we may have some sort of faint knowledge of, and then what happens to those concepts as you're making that trip through the hour-and-a-half movie or whatever.
So I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up to you guys to start thinking about your questions. Do you guys think, one of the things as a viewer, so I produce and direct documentaries and run an awards program, and so I watch a lot of films for Cinema Eye. Like since the advent of reality television, do you feel like subjects have a different relationship to the camera in the last 5-10 years? Because I think like I'm seeing it on the other side.
Yeah.
I feel like it's there, but I'm sort of curious how you guys are all grappling with it, and then I'm going to turn it open it up for questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a continual evolution. I mean, we all see, you know, there used to be this thing, I think maybe 10 years ago, where like before reality TV was ubiquitous, where people would be like, well, you can't get real people anymore on camera. Like you can't get the Frederick Wiseman hospital people anymore. Like everyone plays to the camera anymore. But now, then it sort of gone past just playing to the camera to something else. Like where people, it seems to me like people want to be, they recognize this performance idea that we're talking about. They recognize that that's just a given, and so they want to do something deeper, you know? So you're starting to see that, and I think reality TV is part of it. I mean, it's sort of annoying to be, you know, making feature films that you want to play in movie theaters and be thinking about reality TV this much, but the truth is that it changes, it's changed the way viewers watch real stories.
Yeah, I think it has changed the way people see themselves and their roles in your story, and the fact that they might need to play an exaggerated version of themselves. But also, I see it more because I think that for the audience, a certain style has now been kind of ceded to, owned by reality television, handheld, documentary, you know, exaggerated emotion often. But that and what I see is a little bit of a hazard is that then, you know, there's a definition of documentary that's defined now by another style, which is sort of rigidly not reality television. It's shallow depth of field, and it looks great, you know, and then there's voiceover, and you're like, that's not reality television. But I'm like, that's the same old stuff that I see a lot of.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, you know, where's our space to operate? If it's not that, and it's not reality television, God help us, then where does... And, you know, I struggled with this question making my movie. I'm like, what's my style, you know?
So where did you land? What were you thinking about?
You know, I just landed on like, I'm going to be old-fashioned and just try to do this thing that I still believe has some value if I can do it right, which is people, if you know, now I'm preaching to a small choir, this audience of documentary film fans, and you know, the film hasn't gotten to the world, or maybe it'll just be relegated to, you know, version of reality television or something.
I'll always stay with this film.
But yeah, you know, I was like, you know, to me the currency is like, can you get a moment that you know is immediate, that's, you know, for this particular film that was like, the camera was there to, you know, to sort of see life and emotion in kind of the real time and not have somebody tell me what happened. That was what I was trying to achieve. So that's what I see as the byproduct of reality television, almost more than this like sense that everybody is a performer and has a future star potential.
I agree with both the things that have been said. I mean, I think for me, only tangential kind of reflection that came to mind is I find that one of the most difficult things is to interview for this kind of feature-length, kind of cinematic documentary, is interviewing subjects who are used to giving interviews, who are used to kind of speaking to the press, and that's always the hardest thing to do because knocking them out of that way of thinking. And what I've noticed is when you look through, and this is actually true for most subjects, but especially for these kinds of media-savvy ones, that let's say you do a 4 or 5 hour interview, what I've noticed is that the stuff that I will use will 99% of the time come from the last 20 minutes. And it's when people are sort of rehashing and going back in, and a lot of what the prepared stuff that just feels dead when you watch it recedes, and then something else comes out.
Or when they have to repeat themselves, they'll find a better way to repeat it. You know,
it's more natural.
But it's usually the third or fourth repeat. Yeah.
I was doing a sound mix for my film, and the sound mixer was like, "What's that sound?" And we realized that the majority of the footage of my grandmother, her stomach is growling because she's starving, and I've taken the interview as far as it can go. But all the stuff that's in the movie is when she's starving.
Just is growling.
Exactly. Well, and also
you gotta make them want it.
I know. And then I was watching Fog of War with my father-in-law, who's a neurologist, and he said, "This guy's got early onset dementia." He said the reason he's being so honest is because he's actually in early onset dementia. watching Fog of War, and I was
Wow,
like,
that's
whoa,
amazing.
that blows that movie completely out of the water for me. And on that note, I'm going to open the questions up to the crowd. What do you got, people? Bring it. Right on. First row. Yeah, go to the mic. I'm supposed to tell you that, and I forgot already. My one instruction.
Or she also has a
It can
hand
be
up.
about Esther's abuse of her grandmother.
Exactly.
Thank you. By the name of the panel, Lies My Subject Told Me, it makes me think that you know the truth in going into this. But how could you know the truth in going into it? Or do you know where your story is going when you start?
Well, I mean, I think that there's sometimes, I mean, I guess in a case like working with Victor, there was a lot of quote-unquote facts out there about him, and there was sort of research done by many, many people, books written, et cetera, that would say certain things about him. So you could at least start out, and a lot of times you do start to gauge the conversation by asking sort of very specific, simple, quote-unquote factual questions. And in a way, it's not even something that you necessarily use in the film, but it's a way of gauging the interaction you have and you know, let's say the level of abstraction that they go to in explaining this or that, or how evasive they're being. And I think that it's not necessarily, I think that you use that, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's necessary for you to even know the truth. It's more about, I think that what we do is we analyze human character, and we analyze the way that what people go through when they answer these certain questions, and what feels painful to them, what feels, you know, it's what are the moments when they have to avert their gaze, let's say. And I think that that's kind of the real driver.
You guys?
No, I mean, the appeal, and this relates to what I was saying before too, about wanting to undertake a story in which the story, the outcome, was totally undefined for me, and just to let it carry me forward, and to find the people and the place that would carry me into the story. That's a hard place to make a film, just like financially, because people are like, well, what happens? Where does it go? And so I struggled with that. But to me, that's the most, I don't know, that's very exciting. To go on with some ideas and characters. I wanted to make a provocative suggestion that next year we call this panel Lies I Told My Subject. I think that is really interesting.
That is really good, right?
And I think, this to me relates to this question of accountability, just to go back to that briefly, which is,
so good.
I remember I showed my subject, my film, before we showed it publicly, and it was hard, but he said, now I understand this is your version of the story.
Right.
And I said, yeah, it is, and I think, let's not say the lie, but the understanding, I think, or this sort of, is a lot of trust, but I think at the end of the day, it's my story.
Yeah, and you can't really make a film with someone who doesn't understand that. Brandy says the same thing.
It's hard, but it's hard to make that explicit,
Yeah.
because I think the relationship is based on that unstated. It's sort of a space that allows each party to kind of think what they need to think to continue the relation, like many relationships,
Like families.
all relationships.
Yeah,
family.
and the problem too is this, when you're making a film, you want something to happen, and a lot of times when wanting something to happen means something bad happening, and so you have to deal with that, and you have to sort of create a space wherein, for instance, something, I won't give it away, but something happens in Actress that's was traumatizing, like a action happens, and I knew that we were in good space because Brandy, sometimes she really wanted to be filmed, sometimes she didn't, but the fact that she was immediately, I think I had the thought a second before she did that we need to start filming, that was a good space, because stories, for her, it was, I think Alec Baldwin said this really great thing in that New York Magazine rant about, he said he was talking to Warren Beatty, and he said, The problem with the paparazzi stuff and why Alec Baldwin punches them all in the face and says these things is because when there's a camera on, the actor's instinct is to make it good, like make it dramatic, which maybe reality TV has made it partly that everyone thinks that they need to make it dramatic and like
everyone's Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing like there's this whole thing where it's like good. I mean, and I bet Mr. Bout here probably really happy he's gonna have this really cool movie made about him being a scandal. Like he's just a bigger than life. These are generally speaking, these are bigger than life people, and so that's one of the things that we dealt with. Which is that it's something is happening, but it's how we do it, and we could sort of create a space. Hopefully, we meaning Brandy and I, and then hopefully with the audience, create a space where you can sort of see the thinking behind all those things, and so you don't feel like, oh God, you really made this like melodramatic thing. I mean, melodrama is good, but you made it this thing that pushes me away instead of like makes me think and brings me into it.
Any questions there? You guys have to fight it out. There's two of you right next to each other. You have to fight it out. Right? Cage match.
Sorry. So obviously there's a lot of variety between your subjects and the depths to which your films will delve into their lives. But you've all talked about these relationships that you have with your subjects, and I've always wondered how you even begin to forge those and allow them to become comfortable enough with you to share their versions of the truth and to be vulnerable in front of the camera and to audiences that they don't even know.
I mean,
this goes back into lies you tell your subject.
Yeah, I mean, my situation is really specific, which is that 2 films ago, it's about my half-sister. Last film, it's about one of the wrestlers in Fake It Surreal is my cousin, and Brandy's my neighbor. And not only my neighbor, but like we take care of each other's children. It's really intense. It's not like a distant neighbor. It's like we walk into each other's houses and, she's probably seen me naked probably through the window or something. I'm not accusing you of anything.
Right, yeah.
But it's a very intense...
right? Brandy's like, yeah, but so?
It's a very intense relationship. And that I think that's partly out of necessity for both of us, which is we were next to each other, an actor and a filmmaker. And this is not a film wherein I could say, okay, give me $150,000 to start because I have no clue what's going to happen, and it probably is just going to be me and Brandy in a living room for 90 minutes. Like that, you're not going to, as Jesse was alluding to, you're not going to make, you can't raise a budget on that. So just out of necessity, these super personal relationships organically become projects, things for me, and I want to make movies, and I have to take care of my family, so I have to do other things as well, and so these become like forced situations, sort of almost like, well, who else am I going to make a movie about unless it's Brandy, And Brandy feels the same way, I think. Not to speak for her, you can ask her after the panel, but I think Brandy's like, I want to work and I want to do things. I want to, not that this is an acting performance in a traditional way, but I want to make art. I want to be going through things. I want to have a camera around. I want to be talking about music choices. I want to be thinking like that. So who else am I going to make it with, But my example specific, I think a lot of people will shy away because I also don't, in my films, even if it's about my half-sister, I'm very briefly in it, but I don't want it to be like, me knocking on the door or over there. It's like, I want it to still have some sort of distance and not objectivity, but like observational distance between how you watch the movie, So it's tricky because I remove myself, but then I trust that I don't have to have things in there like, this is all for the camera because hopefully I'm building something that viewers can see that it's all for the camera, but not really, but kind of really, but not really, but kind of really. And then they also, but we don't have to say that because we're hopefully past that point,
But it's okay. But so that's a really sort of extreme version,
yeah.
Right? Like that's not the norm. Jesse, I would say your situation of making a complete leap of faith. You're going from San Francisco to North Dakota and spending time with people that you don't know. Like, what is that experience of? So it's 2 things that you're asking the character to take a leap of faith, but also as a filmmaker, I don't think people realize it's terrifying. It's totally terrifying to go somewhere that you don't know and ask people to enter let you enter their lives with a camera, and then also hope for the best while you're hemorrhaging cash on your family somewhere else. That's all going to work out. So can you talk about
So I
that?
think that's a performance of your own, too. It's a certain amount of emotional availability that you have to offer to expect it in return. And that's the transaction. I don't mean to put it crudely, but that's the relationship. And for me, I don't do that. Like, I'm sort of constitutionally with the other sort of very withholding. And so I like that documentary forces me to be there, be present, be emotionally available, hopefully for people I'm really interested in. And I think, I've directed actors a little bit, but never like a feature film. But I think it's about creating a similar kind of space where, and for me, I worked by myself when I made the film, so there was no crew behind me. It was just me. I think that helps. You're still got a big camera, but I find that because I also wanted to make a film, like I was just really interested in the emotion of the place is what struck me and why I wanted to make the film. And it was like not a, rigorous, rational, intellectual film. It was like an emotional experience, and that's what I saw and what I responded to and what I wanted to put on camera. And so that, and it was not hard for me, I think, to offer that because it was an emotional place because I was, because I felt it. You just feel it. So, but I think about that kind of space that I imagine great directors of great actors, what allows them, if you're an actor, to give a great performance. It's not just because you're a great actor and maybe, you were working with an actor, but it's that you trust your director, and that somehow you create a space for performance to feel truthful.
Max?
I just think you should just be stubborn and show up and keep hanging out.
Well,
because I'm going to
lock helps.
The Russian version, like
No,
just be stubborn and hang out.
It's a bit different because especially, I guess, the films that I've been interested in making are these sort of large subject films where you're sort of making it, and there's a lot of public interest, but essentially you're making a journalistic subject, but then you're trying to Trojan horse as much complexity and sort of formal innovation into it as possible. And in those cases, when you are sort of competing with the media, it's literally just kind of hanging out, because people for the most part don't understand what long-form documentaries are, especially in other countries, and they still just think that it's basically like a TV report. And at first they agree to work with you, and then they become confused that you're still there and you're still kind of trying to get something. And then eventually,
you're tall to be so.
And then you follow them into the shower.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute. I didn't sign up for this.
That was her idea.
and and so then it's kind of eventually I think that they come around, and for me, what's important is that actually are the human relations that form, that it's this alternative form of friendship. I mean, it's also a friendship, but it's okay. You have these. It feels like being married to these people in a sense, because you're making a film like this. Film was, it took 3 years, or it takes at least a year or so. But you're really spending a lot of time, and it's time that's like not exactly social, because you're seeing people in different ways, and they see you in different ways. And so it's this bond that develops, and I think that that's really rich. It's like this kind of alternative form of friendship or collaboration, I guess is a better word. And I think that the only way to get that is just kind of keep showing up.
Excellent. Okay. Next.
All right. So my question is, have any of you had a subject that has like told such a lie that it causes like a roadblock in your like directing or like asking of questions? And if you had have or like would have, how would you like get past that?
I mean, no, I don't think so. Like, mostly because the films that I make usually are like a lot of watching, and then sort of conversations happen, and but like, yeah, what if I guess if Brandy was like, well, there's one interesting thing. If Brandy was just told a bold-faced lie that was like would have destroyed the process, would destroy that trust, there probably would be no movie, or we would have just been like, okay, well, how we work that in to the movie. But in Fake It Surreal, there was this great, it was more of a rib, which is pretty funny. They did this great thing where they had basically throughout the week, we filmed for 1 week, which is different than getting married. I didn't get married to any of those guys.
Yet.
Yeah, I can't wait. No, but we filmed for 1 intense week, and the interesting thing that was over that week they were building the stories for the matches that ends up being the end of the movie. So you kind of they're sort of making their matches more interesting, which is what traditional wrestling storytelling is. it's the film's about a small group of pro wrestlers leading up to like one show basically, and there's these things that were happening. This guy was like, I'm gonna shave my beard possibly in this match, but I'm not gonna tell you. And I was like, don't tell me. I don't want to know. I want to know, like, I don't want to know the outcome of the match. I know you do. I don't want to know. So they did this rib where they said, okay, you can come in while we plan the matches, and we filmed this whole thing, and then they started into an argument about like, well, if I'm shaving my beard, I should be the main event. He's like, no, the main event's the title match. Like, that's traditional. I'm sorry. He's like, are you kidding me? And they like started to pretend to get in a fight, and it was like, I was like, oh, I felt really bad. I was like, shit, like I'm really like crossing a line here. Like these guys are like two really good friends who are getting in this fight. It was all a performance, and I tried so desperately to get it in the movie, but it was that sort of it just basically made everything else seem like less of a performance, which was not really what I wanted to do, because basically it's like I'm leaving, I'm not gonna be in the show, I quit. Walks out, I follow him out with a camera. He did this thing where he slammed the door in my face, and then he goes, well, you might as well just come now. You've been filming this whole thing anyway, which made me feel totally like crap. And these are big, burly wrestler dudes who could kick my ass. And so they were like, I was just kind of like, I gotta not be a coward here and go film. And then he walked outside, and then they were just like, we got you so bad. And I was like, oh man. So that was like, yeah. But because of the movies I'm making, I probably could have got that in there. If I was maybe a better editor, but I just felt it maybe disrupted too much. But I could have got that in there because of the kind of movies I'm making. If Brandy would have told a major lie, which in some ways there are lies in the movie, but if she would have said something that broke our trust, we could have probably worked that in somehow.
I would maybe just say that what might be more hazardous is your subject makes a confession to you. It's not a lie. It's the opposite. I mean, that's what I experienced. It put me and the camera in a particularly challenging position. You know, that's different. And the lie, unless it was a lie about the relationship, sort of the business side of the relationship, I wouldn't think would be an issue.
So the next year's truths, my subject told me.
Yeah.
Yes.
the real
There's
problem.
really nothing better when a subject lies. I mean, 'cause you just let them dig their own
Yeah,
grave.
right. No, that's not a problem. It's when they tell you something before they tell somebody else, and that makes, that's.
Well, that's the different filmmaking too. Like you're like, bring it on. Like let's see you do this. You want that sort of like, you know, stammering about and like sort of like to get something else. Like, you know, it's not even a gotcha thing. It's just more like yeah, you're revealing political truths and ideologies and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think it's also really great because one of the, especially when you use interviews, one of the things that's the biggest challenge is basically how do you make an interview subject a character so they don't feel like that you're interested in watching and what they go through, and things like lies. Like in our film, we have a U.S. government representative that's clearly sort of lying and stammering and doing all these things, and in a way that's the best because that's what reveals their personality, their persona,
and ideology.
They're not just, but they're not just sort of vessels for information. And that moment when that transition happens is really magical in cinema. And in a way, I think that's the major difference between sort of the kinds of movies that we make and sort of television. A lot of times, because television is incredibly uncomfortable with people falling out of that interview position.
Yeah, and actors, there's interviews, and a lot of times they become monologues, which is a lot of interviews are actually like that, but we're trained to sort of cut them up so they can be really pithy and smart and like, you know, get you from one thing to another. But what I like to do is just let it go and really go, because then you start to see it becomes from this thing to, there's one moment where Brandy's like explaining something that's happened, and then this stove sound interrupts. It's like, and I really trust that like 90% of filmmakers would say like, God, take Ruin, like, oh my God. And we just let it go and it holds, and she makes a reference to it to the camera, and then she gets past it, and then she goes to her entire performance changed, and then she goes to another place and another place. And so I think like that's the difference too with from reality television is that time, you know, Act of Killing is full of watching something, then watching it some more, and watching it some more, and by what something means at minute or second 4 versus minute 3 versus minute 9, it completely changes the meaning.
Excellent. I saw someone in the back. You, Mr. Beard. Sorry.
It's a handsome beard.
It is.
I
Very
need
well
to get rid of
done.
this beard. I've actually only seen your film, and I'm really curious, having seen your film, that it seems like since you had such a long relationship with your subject, I'm curious as to if there was ever a point where you guys were having a conversation off camera, as you do, and you say, we need to get that on camera. Like literally say that, or do you instead say, just make a mental note and then say, well, at some point next time we're talking, I'm gonna just be like, I'm gonna push or lead in that way. So and that's kind of specifically. I had a whole bunch of questions written down, but and then the other question is for you guys especially is as you're looking at your subjects in that. You know, once you get to that point where your subject has told you this, has revealed something, or you found that dishonest, or you found somebody kind of digging a hole, at what point do you push them further towards a direction that you might see for your film versus, I mean, to use your own voice to push them forward to more interesting, to more expression, more clear expression of their own personal truth versus the truth that they're trying to push out to the world.
Yeah.
Is there a moment when you don't do that? Max is just like, nope.
No, yeah, no. I mean, there isn't a moment where I wouldn't do that. Yeah. I mean, I think you're thinking, well, I'll answer the first question, both. You know, I mean, is that really a question about manipulation or direction?
Yeah, I mean, yes, manipulation, I guess, on some level. Like, is my voice really not loud enough?
They're recording it, so
yeah. Sorry.
the meta.
You want to know if am I orchestrating? Am I okay? Well,
are you being dishonest
the relationship.
when
It
you
doesn't
lead?
change. It's actually the same. It's the continuation of what the relationship has been, and the sort of all of the calibrations, that are involved in like making a film about somebody, and whether they're suggestions or like, oh, you're going to do that. Well, that I'll film, and that what? Yeah, it doesn't really change. It just becomes a little trickier when it's more sensitive.
I absolutely respect when people have rules, like, well, I don't ever do that or something. I just don't, I can't do it. So for me, there were many times where it'd be like, okay, I'd write down, it'd be exactly what you're saying, which is like write down lines and be like, she said this. Yeah. Either ask her to say it or say it, another way. But what matters is what you're building. Like if you're building a movie.
I think you were lucky to have a very professional actress in that space.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Versus a regular person who say, "Can you say that again?" and they go, "What?"
Yeah, exactly. No, it's
not
true.
Really
no,
true.
I mean it's a construction though. I mean you can't ever get away from the fact that it's a construction. Like you still need someone to go. If someone's going to enter that building, they need to go through the door.
Yeah.
You need a shot of them going through the door.
Yeah.
So sometimes you get it, and then sometimes you're like, dude, you got to go through that door.
But
And I'm gonna sit
Do you mean,
here-
do I say it again, this time with more feeling?
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Would you say you hate your parents?
I mean, it's kind of your job to go back to, it's your job to get the performance,
And I think but it does matter what kind of building you're building. Like if you're building these, I think Maxim's film's different. Like, so what he's building requires certain ways of hammering. Like he's building a different construction. So what you're building matters. And
What
so
kind of pig you are?
yeah. At least and the important part is that you are also showing the audience what you're building. Because if you're building a movie wherein it's very, very important that there's no manipulation, you don't get the shot of them walking through the door.
Yeah.
You miss the shot of them walking through the door. You have to set the scene up another way.
Yeah.
But if you build a film where the manipulation is sort of part of it, or that you accept it, or that like, okay, we're on safe ground here, that shot, you get that shot. And it's really a matter of what you're communicating to the viewer from the outset, you know, and like so there you just give you know, it's a communication.
You know, what I thought was funny about my subject was late in the filmmaking process, he was so conditioned to the camera, and that he would, in a conversation, he would wait for the camera to be on him before he spoke dialogue.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's great, thank you.
Yeah.
That's really helpful.
Walter Murch said something about Gene Hackman blinking in kind of a similar way when he was editing him. But when you asked the question, I kept on, because documentary is kind of morally exhausting in all sorts of ways, but one is this moment, and it's both with lies or with emotion. When you're talking to a person and they start to cry, and you're sitting there and it feels completely dirty because you don't know. At first you want to be just like a mouse, and then you don't know if you should push it or not. And it's just whether you want them to go farther, whether you want them to do more, or you want to just observe. And a lot of times it's not clear, because a lot of times when you ask them to do something, they'll actually get out of that place and go back into sort of more neutral interview mode. But a lot of times you almost can't resist, because there's also a human level to it where you do want to kind of connect and empathize and continue to have some sort of connection with them, even when the camera is rolling. And so it's this, I remember there's a film called The War Photographer, and James Nachtwey, who's the subject of it, says this wonderful thing. He goes, I go to these places, and he films a lot of sort of war atrocities and all these things, and I'm there, and I'm photographing, and I feel completely ashamed of myself for doing it. And I know that if I didn't feel ashamed, that's the way it has to be, because I believe abstractly in what I'm doing, but if I didn't feel ashamed, I know that I will have sort of sold my soul, and it would just be doing whatever or anything else. And I think that that tension is really important, but it really comes up in those moments when you're forced to pause and you're kind of somewhere between a human and a filmmaker.
I mean, but that was part of the reason, just in the beginning, I asked everyone to talk about that line between emotional truth and factual truth, because what you have with every filmmaker is they're going to position themselves on that continuum, all the way from sort of a journalistic objective truth sensibility all the way to like all truth is mutable and it can be anything. And everything you see, all the choices they make, from the interview to the construction of that film, to even how they're shooting and what they're shooting, comes from their sense of where they fall on that line. And that's it. It's like a compass, right? It's like that's how they're navigating. But when you see the final result, you're not necessarily thinking that this is a emotional and ethical construction by an individual, right? But that's actually what it comes down to. Another question? We have two more left.
So you've talked a lot about like ways that you can represent truth, and for some documentaries and for some subjects, like, no offense, the reason I want to watch it is because it's actually like the reason Pussy Riot is cool to watch and be interested about is that like it's real, it actually happened. Mm-hmm. Like there is some element of reality. So how do you operate when it's more of a journalistic subject? Do you just have less tools and just have to avoid them, or do we just have to trust you to be representing something that's real in a real sense?
Well, I'll just say before, I'll just say we're talking about this constructed performance-y stuff, but the basis of what makes nonfiction, powerful is the nonfiction part, Mm-hmm. So we're talking about this all in dialectic with this big nasty thing called reality that we all have to deal with, and also makes everything like to me it's the simple thing of like when you see even the best films, when you see like we walk into a room and you see it's been set dressed, best fiction films, there's an element to that that's like even the very, very best movies, you're like, it's phony, like whereas you cannot set dress a real house. Like when you walk into a real home and you see the way light works and the way things are on the floor, but not just placed on the floor. There's an excitement of reality, and that becomes the excitement of when someone's like going through something and you're experiencing too. Like, I can't believe I get to watch this. It's voyeuristic and powerful, and really like it messes with your head and makes you think about all these sort of things. So all this storytelling stuff and performance-y stuff and construction-y stuff is about how do you work in dialectic with reality, but
Yeah, but I think it's the same. It doesn't really matter in the sense that sure, certain things have more of a topical interest, but then you're still having, when you're making it, you're still kind of having this constant contractual relationship with audience in terms of what they're expecting, what you're giving them, how you're feeding, and how you're creating the drama and the structure. And in a way, things that are, just in themselves sort of interesting, they'll still plateau at like 15 or 20 minutes, and that's why I think the length and the time constraint is very interesting. Like whatever the minimum length that we all work with is a significant thing, because actually watching something for that long is a challenge. It requires a certain kind of different restructuring of your attention, or else you'll plateau. And I think it is actually fundamentally different. We talked about TV before, than something like 48 minutes. It's a huge difference, or something, you know, like 10 minutes. You can watch anything for 10 minutes.
But do you think I also think it's about setting the rules kind of straight out of the
Yeah.
gate. Like I think the first 5 minutes of a movie should tell you what
the movie is.
What the rules of the movie are, right?
Yep.
These are long shots, these are short shots, this is journalism, this is art film, this is whatever. It's like you have, because then you can kind of, like, one more question. I can barely see you, got light blinding behind you.
First
You're
5
like,
minutes and then
right,
you
yeah,
coast.
you're like God, because you just have this giant light behind your head.
I'm sorry. A long time ago, I saw a film called The Sorrow and the Pity. Some of you may know this, about the French resistance, and this is in the 70s. And the reason I came to this this seminar was because that film, it was a long film, and about halfway through it, you realized everybody in this movie is lying. And in the 40 years since, to me, it's like, you know, everybody just about is lying that has anything to hide. And we're talking about everybody you see on television. And the power of this movie was, halfway through the movie, even though you knew everybody was lying, you had an idea of what was going on about this particular circumstance, because the filmmaker had put 20 people in front of the camera, and you realized that this guy is a lying SOB. These other people are partly misremembering and partly trying to make themselves look better. And some people just flat out are lying because they have a good reason to. And to me, the power of documentary is that. You come out of the theater and you go, I have some idea of what's going on here because I know who's lying. And so, anyway.
That's very dependent on the filmmaker, though. Because you can go, like,
Right.
everyone's lying, and then, like, 3 weeks later you read something, you're like, oh, the filmmaker was lying.
So,
Right?
anyway, I just say that I appreciate what you guys do, because that's very difficult, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Oh,
Very
that was
nicely
it.
said. That's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Should we just, on that note, let's go out into the sun.
Yeah, that's
People.
good.
Let's have some reality. Bring it. Cheers. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.